Hello, everyone. It's Friday, and welcome to another session of the World Reconfigured: Consequences of Russia's War on Ukraine. I'm Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross.
And hi, welcome everybody. I'm Steve Barnes from George Mason University. We're really delighted to have you all with us. We hold these conversations every Friday with a rotating group of guests to talk not only about this war, but also about the broader question of authoritarian challenges to democracy around the world. Just a quick program note as we're starting here, we will be starting at a different time next week to accommodate the schedule of our speaker. Our speaker next week is Rana Mitter, who's a specialist in Chinese history and politics. And he'll join us at noon, and that is notably Eastern Daylight Time. So please note that we will be changing time over the weekend here in the United States. So if you're outside of the United States joining us, just double check what time it will be for you. So today we're really lucky to have with us Alexandra Vacroux, who is the executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. The Davis Center has long been a critical resource for those studying the region, and it just so happens that both Cynthia and I had postdoctoral fellowships there at different points in our career. Alexandra is a specialist on a broad array of subjects in Russian and Eurasian politics. She lived in Moscow from 1992 to 2004, doing a whole variety of different things, consulting for the Russian privatization agency, serving as a partner in an investment bank, on the board of the United Way. She spent time with us here in the DC area at the Kennan Institute, the Russian Studies wing of the Woodrow Wilson Center, prior to taking up her appointment at Harvard. She has appeared on a whole slew of different mass media, and I'll call your attention in particular to an article that she wrote for the Boston Globe, marking 1 year since the full-scale invasion, on how we can help Ukraine to stand its ground. And I'll provide a link to that for you in the chat here in just a moment. So as is our usual practice, I've asked Alexandra to speak for a few minutes at the beginning, giving us some things to think about in our conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from Cynthia and me and from all of you, whether in the chat or by raising your hands and asking your questions live. And with that, Alexandra, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve and Cynthia. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I've been warned that this is an extremely informed audience, and so I had better know my stuff. So I'm going to try and cover a little bit of material that you might be slightly less familiar with, some of the economic implications of the war and how they're affecting us. But of course, we can talk about anything when it comes to questions. So let me share my screen. And I'll probably go pretty fast so that we have plenty of time for questions, but I can always come back to something afterwards if you want. So let me make sure. Does that look okay?
We have a black screen at the moment.
Okay, let me see why that happened.
Oh, there we go.
I'll try that. How's that?
We're once again to a black screen.
That's weird. It's not letting me do slideshow in the normal way. Why? It's going straight to presentation mode. Well, you know what? Let's just do it this way.
Okay, that'll work.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah.
So the war in Ukraine, you are all very familiar with it. It has had a devastating impact, particularly in Ukraine. But one of the things that we've been asking ourselves is why it is that even though there's been quite a lot of support, we don't necessarily see Russian intentions or capabilities changing. So I want to talk a little bit about primarily the economic side. And let me start with what the impact has been on Ukraine. Let's see how I'm going to change my slides here.
Why don't you try the slideshow one more time?
Okay, it was going to presenter mode
for
some reason.
Strange.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Does that work?
Not now, but it did just. Can you go forward or back?
What do you see? What do you see there?
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I don't know why it's doing the presenter mode. That's so weird. How's that?
That's beautiful.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So Russia's war in Ukraine. So the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that the biggest effect has, of course, been on Ukraine, which is getting devastated in many ways. We see a lot of pictures, of course, of collapsed buildings. We also hear a lot of the power shortages. And just to help you conceptualize this, this is a NASA map of Ukraine around Thanksgiving. And you can see that it's essentially dark because Russia keeps targeting the energy grid and the energy transformer stations, and was deliberately doing that during winter so that people would be cold, unable to take elevators up to their high rises, would not have water because the water is pumped with electricity. And that has made it quite difficult for Ukrainians to live. But of course, they continue to resist. So it hasn't had the effect that the Russians were hoping. The other thing the Russians have done is continually targeted Ukraine's ability to export grain. And I would say that the food crisis that started last year when Russia had blockaded the Black Sea ports and which kept Ukraine from exporting some of its grain is still continuing. So there is a deal that allows Ukraine to get some of its grain out through Odessa. It looks like that will probably be renewed. But if you take into account the fact that Russia and Ukraine together used to account for a third of world grain exports, any reduction in Ukrainians' ability to plant, harvest, store, and ship the grain is going to have an impact, particularly in the global south that depends on grain imports. So right now, if we look at commodity prices, we can see that the price of grain has come back down a little bit, but now there are other ripple effects, which is the price of rice has gone up because countries like Iraq, for example, are shifting from bread and a wheat-based diet to buying more rice. So I really like to think about it as kind of the ripple effect. You have different ripples that are spreading out, and the effect on commodity markets, be it rice, be it fertilizer, which is also very important, for example, in Africa, so that the harvests that come in are maximally large. Also, of course, on energy, which I'll come back to in a second. Where are the sanctions biting in Russia? You know that we've imposed a huge number of sanctions, financial sanctions against Russian banks, sectoral sanctions against Russian imports of, say, computer chips or avionics or car parts. We've imposed personal sanctions on oligarchs, confiscating their yachts and things like that. And then they're self-sanctioning by corporates. There's a lot of sanctions. There are now 10 rounds of sanctions that have been very well coordinated between the US and Europe. And yet, you know, we don't see any indication that Russia is diminishing its efforts in Ukraine. And why is that? Well, one of the answers is that the sanctions are biting in some places, but not others. So if you look here on the left, you see that vehicle manufacturing, trucks and passenger cars is way down, between 50 and 70 and 80% year on year. So if you wanted to buy a new car in Moscow, and some people do, you would go to the dealership and it's empty because the manufacturers do not have the parts that they need to complete the cars. And even though Russia liberalized some of the rules, so now you don't need anti-lock brakes, for example, you don't need side airbags, you don't need to have the GPS systems. Even so, it's been difficult for the companies to be able to produce the cars. The other big shock has been on retail. So nobody's weeping that Gucci is empty or Prada is empty because they no longer ship into Russia. But one of the things that we've noticed is that the Gucci store isn't there because Gucci, you know, said they were pulling out, but Gucci goods are still coming into Russia through Armenia and Georgia and all of those places where there are long lines of trucks now waiting to import Gucci from Armenia, right, as opposed to buying Gucci that's imported into Russia. Right, let me get back to my slides. So why,
Alexandra, I apologize to interrupt. Yep. We're still, for some reason, we're seeing like sort of 2/3 of your screen.
Really?
So we're missing a little bit of the charts. I don't know quite how to explain what's going on there.
Which part are you missing?
So it's as if we have kind of the upper left quadrant, kind of 2/3 of it, and we're missing sort of parts toward the bottom and the right side.
Well, that is very inconvenient. Let me go back to what I was doing before. How's that?
There we can see it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's a beautiful slide.
Okay, so Why are sanctions not biting? Well, they're not biting because all through last year, Russia was still able to sell its oil and gas products into Europe and was making 500 to 1 billion euros per day on those sales. So we estimate that the cost of running the war is 300 or 350 million euros a day. And if you're earning way more than that on a daily basis because of the sale of hydrocarbons, then you can continue fighting this war for as long as possible. Now, from December, Europe banned the import of seaborne crude. So any crude that was going to the Netherlands, for example, on tankers can no longer come into Russia. Pipeline gas is also way down. Even before Nord Stream blew up, the gas imports had been way down, but Russia has been able to sell most of that volume to India and China. True, at lower prices, but they have not had to cut back on production. They're still producing about 11 million barrels a day, and they're still getting significant income from that. And let me just say that that is actually, to some extent, in our interest, because what the US administration and the Europeans did not want is for Russia to pull back on its supply of oil and gas and lead to further spikes in the price. So there's a very delicate balance here between wanting to punish the Russians and reduce their ability to gain the money that they need to finance the war, and the fact that we don't want to see 1973 type of oil shortages because there's just not enough oil on the global market. And the Europeans were very lucky this summer that it was a mild winter and they had managed to store plenty of natural gas. But prices were very expensive, right? People had their bills go up from maybe 100 euros a month to 1,000 euros a month just to do very basic heating of their houses. And so there was a very strong incentive not to penalize the Russians to the point where the Europeans were going to have issues. Oops. So Moscow does not look like this, right? This is Moscow in the 1990s, people standing in line for bread. I remember when I was there and you would get change, they would kind of scoop out a big pile of coins and dump it in your hand because the hyperinflation made the coins so worthless that it really didn't even matter how much they were giving you back. Moscow actually looks kind of like New York. I mean, more stores might be closed or shuttered, but for the most part, people are doing fine. And that's part of Putin's strategy of making sure that in the cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and Ekaterinburg, life goes on more or less as normal. In the rural areas, probably they feel, the lack of imported detergents and cookies even less. And so it hasn't really changed the standard of living in Moscow yet. Nonetheless, the fact that retail has gone down suggests that people are saving more money, they're spending less because they are nervous about what might happen with the economy. Why is it that we haven't seen a reduction in the standard of living? Well, one of the reasons is that if you look at what is being imported into Russia, you can see on the right-hand side there, after the war starts, there's a huge drop in imports, and then gradually it climbs back up. And that's because sanctions, unless they are continually tightened, automatically lose their bite over time, right? People find ways to go around it. They're shipping that Gucci stuff through Armenia. And eventually you see countries like China, that's the light blue in the middle or the medium blue in the middle, and to some extent Turkey, pick up the slack and start importing goods that were previously coming from Europe. So even though it's very important to have sanctions, it's very important to be kind of punishing Russia and to have continually added waves of sanctions. Russia is not going to be economically squeezed into no longer fighting, right? In order to do that, you need to do something else. And you need to take into account that Putin is relying on China to fill a lot of the gaps. So as I'm sure your speaker next week will probably say, right before the war started, Russia and China announced that they had a partnership without limits. Now, this wasn't an alliance, so it's not a self-defense kind of relationship where if one were attacked, the other would automatically come to their rescue, like NATO. But it was an alliance that was meant to improve the bilateral ties between the two countries in the area of trade, military cooperation, educational cooperation, scientific cooperation, etc. And the idea was, at least in the Russians' mind, that they were more or less equal. Now, the Chinese, if you ask them, were pretty patronizing is too strong, but it was always clear to them that the Russians were, weaker than they were in many ways. Russia has punched above its weight economically for a long time, but still, Russia had something to offer to China. Since the war started, indications are that Xi Jinping is quite upset that Putin hasn't managed to take care of this little escapade that he thought was only going to take 3 days. And the global environment has been destabilized, which isn't good for China. China doesn't like destabilization. And China has been put into a difficult position of wanting Russia to survive and also wanting to ensure that its trade with the European Union and with the United States continues. So the result is that Russia has become much more dependent on China. But is China dependent on Russia? Well, the way that I think about this is, sorry, that's jumping ahead, is I look at the extent to which Chinese exports are going to different countries. And what we see is 16% of Chinese exports go to the United States. The United States is by far China's biggest trading partner. And then there are all sorts of European countries and also some other countries, but Russia accounts for only 2%, maybe that's now 4% of Chinese exports. So China is not going to be missing trade with Russia. China must be getting something else from Russia. So they're getting someone who's willing to poke the United States, which they appreciate. They're also getting highly enriched uranium, which allows them to build their own nuclear weapons. That's a big plus. In fact, Russia is still supplying highly enriched uranium in the US. There's a New York Times article about that today. It's also providing a lot of the uranium that power plants need in Europe. Rosatom is really having a boom right now in the export of nuclear technology and nuclear fuel. And so that's quite good for China. But I'm cutting short a lot of my story here because I've been told to only take 10 minutes. So let me go to the question that everybody's asking, which is, how does this war end? And the literature on war termination argues or finds on the basis of research that since World War II, there are basically 4 possible outcomes to conflict. And before I start, I should say that of the conflicts that have been studied by Uppsala University, and they're cited in this paper that I mentioned, a quarter of them end in a week, another quarter of them end in a year, and the wars that don't end in a year go on for a long time. So with that framework, let's think, what is it that could mark an end to the war? So one is that you could have total victory from either for the Ukrainians or for the Russians. But if we think about that what that actually looks like, it's pretty unlikely, right? Zelensky has said since October that Ukraine's goal is to push Russia completely out of Ukrainian territories, including Crimea. All right, that is going to be very difficult to achieve, even with the steadily more lethal weaponry that it's getting from the US and from Europe. They're basically at a stalemate now. They might be able to get some territorial advances, particularly in the south, but getting the Russians out of areas where they've been entrenched now since 2014 is going to be extremely difficult. And even if they did, chances are Russia would be sitting back, rebuilding its forces and waiting until it could come again to try a second round of invasion. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, this is a poster from Moscow. It's a quote from Putin, which is, Russia's borders don't end anywhere, right? Russia's goal, it's been rebranded in a number of different ways, but the overall goal is control over Ukraine. And whereas Russia would have once been satisfied to have just political control, put in a puppet government, get Zelensky assassinated or out of the country, that's what they call denazification. It's basically regime change. All of the other goals like protecting Russian speakers or fighting NATO, all of those are basically euphemisms for getting to control Ukraine because it's part of their sphere of influence. And if that is Russia's goal, and Ukraine is determined not to allow it to achieve that goal, total victory is not possible for Russia either. So if total victory isn't an option, then we have either a negotiated settlement, which is extremely complicated, particularly if neither side is in the mood to compromise, or an armistice along the lines of what we have in Korea. And both of those could potentially be durable, but they require that the sides come to the table in good faith. And what we know is that negotiations end wars not because one side or the other changes their goals, but because they change their understanding of their capability to achieve those goals. And that comes on the basis of what happens on the battlefield. So Russia would have to realize that actually European support and American support is not going to wane. They're going to continue providing weaponry to Ukraine, and Russia is not going to be able to take over the country. Or the Ukrainians would have to realize, the West is getting tired. Maybe there's a new presidential administration in the US that's not going to be providing them with the kind of weapons they need, and therefore they're not going to be able to achieve their actual goal. They'll have to make some compromises. Now, Putin's assumption is that, what we consider the strength of democracy, which is the ability to elect your leaders and to have public opinion influence policy, he sees that as the fundamental weakness of democracy, because that means that if the population becomes convinced that we're wasting our money on Ukraine, or the president thinks that NATO is just a useless relic, or far-right populists come to power in, let's say, in Europe, and no longer are willing to avoid buying Russian oil, all of those ways in which popular opinion and support can affect politics is eventually going to kick in, and the West will stop supporting Ukraine. And at that point, the Russians can come out of their trenches and accomplish their goals. So Putin is convinced that time is on his side. And because that's the case, and because there is a risk of Ukraine fatigue, the Ukrainians understand that they really need to accomplish as much as possible in as fast as possible a time frame, particularly before the American election. So the op-ed that I wrote that Steve referred to basically says, if we believe that Ukraine must be supported, and that Russia is a malevolent influence on the global politic and must be stopped, we should be doing that now, because the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets, the harder it is to maintain support, the more the Russians are dug in, and it will just become more and more expensive for us, and potentially riskier if Russia does decide to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. And on that kind of mic drop moment, I think I'm going to stop and open it to questions. I think that was my last slide. Yes, so let me stop sharing. And I am thrilled to take questions.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And in some ways, I think how you finished is one of the things that's been driving us through this series, and the things that we've been talking about, and precisely this belief that Putin has that authoritarianism can outlast democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get this started, and we've already got a few questions in the chat, and Cynthia and I will share those with you as we go. I do invite people to raise their hands too, and we'll recognize you and let you ask your questions directly. But I wanted to start with this. So the chart that you presented on truck and auto manufacturer is quite impressive. Let's say the impacts in this area. So I'm wondering about sort of section-specific impacts of sanctions, and in particular here, I'm wondering what we know about how sanctions are impacting the ability of Russia to rearm, to continue to produce the tanks and the artillery and all of these kinds of things. Because certainly one of the things that I was reading in the early stage was, this is where it's really going to hit, right? We're going to turn all of their smart weapons into dumb weapons, because they're not going to have the microchips to be able to create precision guided munitions, and that this kind of thing was going to ultimately impact them on the battlefield. Do we see any evidence of this? Kind of what's your read on this sort of sector specific impact of sanctions here?
So that's a great question. And the answer is that we're not entirely sure. One of the problems is that it's very difficult right now to understand what's happening in the Russian economy. The Ministry of Finance and the central bank have classified a lot of the information about the economy that used to be publicly available. And indeed, I used to have a slideshow where I would show a picture of Uralvagonzavod, which is a tank making factory, at a standstill because they couldn't get the microchips that it turns out they had been importing in order to build tanks. And what we hear is that the Russians are now able to import some chips, not as high quality as what they were getting from Taiwan or from Germany, but they have been able to import chips from China that they can use in some of their military transport vehicles, tanks, and so on. Apparently, they have a high failure rate. The chips have a high failure rate, and they're not as sophisticated as what they used to be importing. But I think one thing that surprised everyone is the extent to which, like, this is a pretty, if I may say, primitive type of fighting, right? These are tanks against tanks, shells against shells, artillery versus artillery. And so slightly dumber weapons than what the Russians had been touting that they were building is probably not as big a problem as it would have been if they were fighting NATO. Right. And one of the things that has surprised us is, for example, on the missile strikes yesterday on Ukraine, there were 6 Kinjal supersonic weapons that were used. Right. I mean, that's a bit, I mean, this is not the right expression, but it's a bit of overkill for what they're doing. Right. And they're using, for example, missiles that are supposed to be used against ships on apartment buildings. So there does seem to be a mismatch in terms of what the Russians have available to fight with. And I would assume that what they're building now is kind of the dumber weapons that they just, launch, and they don't actually care what they hit, right, in many cases. In terms of the other sectors, I mean, vehicles seem to be extremely hard hit compared to some of the others. And that's also because there were a lot of foreign car manufacturers like Renault, like Chevy, that were assembling cars at factories in the region. And those companies pulled out, but the factories continue producing, but the supply chains also were interrupted when those companies pulled out. So they will be able to replace those eventually. But in the meantime, one thing we've noticed is there's a lot more Chinese imported cars in Moscow. Like, I never saw a Chinese car before, and now they're everywhere. They're inexpensive, and the Chinese are happy to have a market. So I think you'd have to go sector by sector. One thing I can say is that in food, there doesn't seem to have been a huge impact, in part because the sanctions introduced after 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, had already triggered development of local agriculture and import substitution. And so things are pretty well supplied when it comes to food. It's kind of higher end consumer products like, sanitary products or paper towels or diapers or things like that. Those are what have really disappeared from the shelves, but there are cheaper Chinese versions of those that can be imported and that are not sanctioned. So I think we're following it closely, but I think on the sectors that matter for remilitarization, the Russians are able to get what they need, alas.
Let me just jump in again real quick, Cynthia. I know you want to go, but just because there's a question in the chat here from Doug that is also sort of this sector specific. And he said early on there was talk about avionics sanctions that might ground Russian domestic airline travel. And he wondered if you had any information about this.
Yes, this is fascinating. So yes, avionics are heavily sanctioned. So Russia can no longer import airplane parts. And what they did is, when the war started, they basically confiscated all of the leased airplanes that were in Russia. So a lot of Russian airlines were leasing Airbuses and Boeings, and the Russians just kept them. But because they violated those lease agreements, that means that those planes are no longer certified to fly internationally. So they can fly domestically, like there was some kind of convoluted regulation that was introduced, but they're not insured and certified to fly internationally anymore.
In fact, Alexandra, sorry to interrupt, but if they land internationally, they can be confiscated.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's also why, I mean, for one thing now, I had a friend who flew from Moscow, I think, to Yerevan, and instead of it taking 2 hours, now it takes 4 hours because they have to avoid European airspace that Russian aircraft are not allowed to fly into. But what happens is, like, first of all, you're only supposed to use certified parts. So you're repairing your Airbus, you're only supposed to use certified Airbus parts. And that's no longer possible. However, because they confiscated some of these, they're cannibalizing some of those airplanes and using those for spare parts. So we haven't really seen a reduction in domestic air travel capability. Eventually that will happen because they're going to run out of planes that they can cannibalize, and there's no way that they can increase domestic production of aircraft fast enough to replace those planes. And that will be very interesting to follow because, of course, they do have an extensive rail network, but it's a huge country, right? And it takes days to go from Moscow to Vladivostok as opposed to, 7 or 8 hours by plane. So they really do need a domestic airlines industry in order to govern the country. And at some point, they're going to get pressure from the lack of parts, but it hasn't happened yet.
Thanks. So I have actually 2 questions, and I have to ask you for forgiveness because I just realized how limited my knowledge of is in regards to like how economics works. But listening to your presentation and seeing in particular your slides where you show how like the imports are being sort of made up. Over time, right? I mean, there's a period of adjustment, but then Turkey and China step in to sort of help make up the difference. And like you said, these changes occur, and then there's sort of different waves of consequences as different countries look for opportunities and different alliances emerge. And so I'm just wondering, do sanctions grow more effective or less effective over time? I mean, there's a separate issue of the weapons supply, which I think is critical, like Steve was saying. But in net total, like aside from the moral aspect of it, I mean, Russia seems to be dealing with this with like rather tremendous flexibility. So I was just wondering, in this broader question of effectiveness, where you come down. Particularly as we go past the 1-year mark, and then also to sort of change focus for a second. I know that you did all of this work on corruption in the Russian economy. I mean, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and I was wondering. I mean, I thought that also, at least initially, some of these sanctions were designed, or at least people hoped that they would put more pressure on the oligarchs, right? Like the wealthy, the people who had assets in the West that they were attached to, and that somehow Putin would be worried about possibly losing their support, and that could help generate opposition. And I don't know. I just wonder if you could also sort of comment a little bit on maybe how they've reconfigured their alliances or their investment focus.
I would love to. So let me just talk a little bit about sanctions in general first, right? So sanctions are most powerful as a deterrent the day before they're actually applied. So when you tell Russia, if you invade Ukraine, we are going to cut you off from the dollar and freeze your reserves and kick you out of SWIFT, you're hoping that Russia is going to say, holy smokes, like there's no way we can stand that. Like, we're not going to invade Ukraine. Once Russia invades Ukraine and the sanctions go into place, right, the Russian point of view is those are never going to get lifted, right? So now I need to find a way to work around them because, you look at things like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was introduced in the 1970s because Russia wasn't letting Jews, or the Soviet Union wasn't letting Jews immigrate. And so there were restrictive conditions placed through a law. And that law was only lifted a few years ago, and only to be immediately replaced by a new punitive law, the Magnitsky Law. And so the Russians assume that like once sanctions are imposed, like they're there forever. But the lesson from 2014 and the invasion of Crimea, and what the Russians expected when they invaded, is that there would be a lot of noise, there would be a lot of talk of sanctions, and then like everything would go back to normal. Yes, there would be some new sanctions. So for example, since 2014, Russia hasn't been able to import the high technology equipment it needs to drill in the Arctic and to explore its Arctic oil fields. But I would point out that Nord Stream 2, the big gas pipeline, that agreement was signed in 2015 after the invasion of Crimea. So in a way, the Russians were most shocked that the West has remained very outraged by the invasion of Ukraine because they thought that we didn't really care about Ukraine and about them taking different territory. So one of the important lessons, right, is that sanctions not only have to be imposed, but as I mentioned, they have to be continually tightened because people find ways to work around them. And that's one of the reasons why we're now on the 10th wave of sanctions, additional industries being sanctioned, additional individuals being sanctioned, because if you just fixed where we were, let's say at the end of February on the first round of sanctions, like they would long be ineffective. But it is true that we've been surprised at the extent to which the Russian economy has been resilient. And part of that we explain by saying, okay, the lessons from 2014 and then from COVID were that to some extent, isolating the Russian economy and some of those supply chains, particularly in agriculture, allowed Russia to practice being autarkic, to practice being less globalized than some of its counterparts would have been. The other thing is that, the other countries that we've imposed a lot of sanctions on, like Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, they are tiny compared to Russia, right? Russia was the 11th largest economy in the world. It is not that easy to cut that kind of economy off from everything else. And I just want to share a slide. I have an additional slide here to show you the other reason that Russia has been able to get around the sanctions is that if you look at who's exporting to Russia, you can see that, I have marked there for 2022. So that's right after the war. Exports go down and then gradually different countries step up. So Turkey and Kazakhstan have been selling more. China, you can see it's not that big of an increase, but China is Russia's biggest trading partner. So it's not a huge increase compared to where it was, but it's still the biggest trading partner. It's not Turkey that's the biggest trading partner. And so what you find is that, like everywhere else, there's an opportunity here for companies or for countries that see that the new sanctions regime gives them an opportunity to make money where, maybe there were German suppliers beforehand, and now there can be Malaysian suppliers.
And the oligarchs?
Oh, and the oligarchs, right. Yes, thank you for that. So the other thing is when you think, we're going to apply sanctions and you think like, how are they going to work? Well, you could think they're going to make things so bad for the population that people are going to take to the street in mass protest and demand an end to the regime. So that hasn't worked in Cuba or in Iran, at least not when it comes to economic sanctions. And there's very little indications that it's going to work for Russia, right? I mean, even if you look at the protests in Iran and in China since the beginning of the year, similarly repressive regimes, if not more repressive, and people are flooding into the streets to demand change, like that is not happening in Russia. Not because there aren't some brave people out there protesting, but it's just not reached the level of outrage where people are going to force the regime to pull out of Ukraine. The second thing is you might think that sanctions are going to put pressure on Putin's cronies, right? And that's why you sanction them, you take away their yachts, you don't let their wives go and shopping in Paris. But the assumption there is that you're going to be able to split off the oligarchs from support for Putin. Right? That they're going to say, wait a minute, like, I can't make money under this guy. Forget him. Let's get somebody new. But the fact is that the oligarchs that we have now are not the same as the oligarchs in the 90s, which were kind of, self-made. I mean, maybe illegally, but self-made men. The people who are rich now are people who are rich because they are close enough to Putin that they're basically given, rent seeking opportunities. They get to control Gazprom or Rosneft or Rostec, some of the big companies, and then they get money from the position that Putin put them in. So if they split with Putin, they lose their job, they lose their income, they probably, lose their mistress, maybe they lose their life, like all sorts of bad things happen to you because you have no independent source of wealth. Like you only are wealthy sort of at the pleasure of the czar or at the pleasure of Putin. So there's actually no way that the oligarchs are going to split off from Putin. So at that point, sanctions, they really are only about punishing Russia and not because you think it's going to economically force Russia out of Ukraine, get the population out on the street, or get the oligarchs to abandon him. Like none of those things seem likely.
Let me ask one more question from the chat and then we'll let Christopher jump in. Gail Coleman wrote early on, there was a lot of talk about banking sanctions. And I know you mentioned SWIFT. Did they not have any effect? She writes, can we do more? I mean, I certainly remember that, there was this talk that, if you pull them out of SWIFT, like this is going to be absolutely devastating. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about that sector.
Sure.
So, but at the same time, also, I just read today or yesterday that like Apple Bank pulled out, but now the Russian banks have started their own system of having like QR codes that you can, use in the stores and things. So again, that adaptation you were talking about.
Exactly. And local competitors that are only too happy that Apple Pay is gone. Fantastic. Like now we can move in. So the banking sanctions are very interesting, right? So we're talking about SWIFT, like kicking Russia out of SWIFT. Ooh, that's the nuclear option, right? Like their banks are not going to be able to send money. And the way SWIFT works is that it doesn't move the money, but it tells the banks where the money is going. It's like a messaging app for banks. So it says, hey, I'm sending $1 million from Italy to Germany from this account to that account. And so the idea was, if you don't have SWIFT, like, I don't know, maybe the bankers have to pick up the phone and say, we're just wiring you this money. And it increases transaction costs and makes things difficult. Now, Russia and China both have alternative systems, like alternative messaging platforms. But the key is like, it's like being on a social media network. Like, I don't know if anyone's tried Mastodon, but if your friends aren't on there, then it doesn't matter if you are, because you're not able to talk to them. And that's the same thing. SWIFT has 11,000 banks and the Chinese has 300 and the Russian one has like 40. So like your friends aren't on there, that's not going to help you. But I would say that there were two other impositions on the banking sector that were more important. So one was the freezing of central bank reserves, which really shocked a lot of people because that had not been done on that scale before. Putin had accumulated about $600 million as a rainy day fund, but it wasn't, in gold bullion in the basement of the Kremlin, right? It was in dollars and euros all over the world. And they lost access to that money. So of the 600 billion or so, Russia ended up having access to about 150, which is what it did have in gold bullion in the basement of the Kremlin and what it had in China and a few other friendly countries. And that was something that was anticipated to have a limit on whether Russia was going to be able to spend what it needed to spend on the war. However, great news for Russia, oil and gas prices went up, and so they were able to compensate for that by the high prices last year. And then the third impact, which I think was actually the most important one, is that sanctioned Russian banks were not allowed to use their correspondent banks in New York. So you might know that 80% of global transactions go through the dollar or the euro. And so even if, let's say, a German company is buying from something in Japan in yen, what it's likely to do is the German bank has a euro account and it has a correspondent bank in New York, and it sends the euros to New York. They get turned into dollars. And then the Japanese bank also has an account in New York in dollars. It takes those dollars and then it sends them back home and converts them into yen. So even if you have transactions in non-dollar currencies, very often they go through the dollar, and the Russian banks could no longer do that. So that really cut them out of the global financial system more than anything else. Now, what did that mean? That meant that Russia was not able to go to global financial markets to raise money. They continue selling local bonds, and the central bank buys them, or some Russian banks buy them because they can't invest elsewhere either. And it must be said that the Ministry of Finance and the Russian Central Bank are run by extremely well-qualified technocrats that have done an amazing job of stabilizing the economy and are basically credited with the fact that whereas we had anticipated the Russian economy might shrink 15% in last year, it actually shrank between 2.5% and 4%. And that's because they very carefully managed to manipulate is not the right word, but they basically limited currency transactions. They allowed more money within the system, within the Russian system, to flow in order to avoid bank runs. They made sure that ATMs were being stocked with money, so there weren't bank runs that could have destabilized the whole system. So there has been an impact, right? Russia can't raise money on global capital markets, which is basically how economies grow, but it hasn't been a collapse either, not of the ruble. In fact, they're trying now to slowly weaken the ruble because it's been too strong, and not of the banks that are still operating in Russia.
Great, Chris, let's go to you.
Yeah. Alexandra, are you familiar with the work of Jeffrey Sonnenfeld of Yale School of Management?
Yes.
He maintains that Russia's economy is smaller than Chile's.
Yeah.
and that much of what is being reported from the World Bank and the IMF are bogus numbers that Russia has stopped reporting since the second quarter of 2022. Financial figures from that are required actually from the World Bank, and basically they're just spewing out propaganda from Rosstat, or the Federal Service for State Statistics. Do you agree with that?
You know, I'm not an economist, so I haven't played around in the numbers. I mean, first of all, the Russian economy, it's the 11th largest in the world, but it's not that big, right? I mean, it was the size of Spain's, for example. I don't know what Chile's economy is, but you know, I mean, after you have the kind of the top 5 or 6 economies, the rest of them start to be 2% of global GDP, right? So they're all kind of small. And Russia has always punched above its weight in terms of its economic capacity. Now, I know economists are very interested in what the growth figures are. I'm not sure it makes that much of a difference, to be honest, in part because there's a lot that we can't know. So we're all making estimates and trying to fill in the blanks. And second of all, because they're basically shifting the economy now to a war mobilization system, right? They're centralizing as much as possible. The resources that they have are going to 2 things. They're going to the military and defense, and they're going to public subsidies to populations that could otherwise be problematic, like pensioners. So we might not see any spending on schools or hospitals or infrastructure, but for sure, those pensions are going to continue being paid. The budget workers, which is about 1/3 of the economy, are going to continue getting their salaries, and they're going to be continuing to try and replace some of the materiel that they're using in Ukraine. But I think, you know, there's no way that the Russian economy after the war is going to be even what it was before the war because of what they've lost.
Because one of the things, I mean, your figures seem to agree with his, that the auto industry, he says, is down 99% in Russia. Retail industry in Russia is down 65%. The workforce is even more of a government workforce than it was before the war, because of all the unemployed engineers and things like that. And either they've left the country or they're sweeping streets or whatever. So that means that he has to dig into reserves to pay for their salaries. Then, as you said too, you mentioned this too, that they are cannibalizing refrigerators for chips that can be used by the military. And he claims that this was, I just watched an interview with him on Deutsche Welle. And I'm not an economist either. I'm a retired research librarian. But then he also went on to say that the ruble, no one really knows what the ruble is worth because it's not an exchange currency. It's not even traded on the black market. But what struck me most about what he said was that he claims that the Russian gas is being replaced permanently in Europe by LNG. That he has lost a major gas customer that cannot be made up by China or India because there are no pipelines that can supply gas to those 2 countries. And I mean, this sounds to me like, and like you, he's also said that sanctions are not enough, that they help Ukraine, but at the same time, we do need, and I don't know why we can't get these tanks to them sooner. I mean, Germany has promised them, I don't know, many Leopard tanks, and I would like to see Ukraine reclaim the Donbass. I don't know about Crimea, but I really would like to see Ukraine push the Russians out of the Donbass completely.
Thanks, Christopher. Let's let Alexandra respond.
Sorry.
So one of the very interesting things is that it looks like Putin really thought that he had the high card when it came to oil and gas markets, right? He assumed that there was no way that the Europeans were going to sanction and punish themselves by not taking in Russian oil and gas. And I have another slide that I can show you, which is quite evocative. It shows where Europe imports its gas. And Russia is the purple section at the bottom. And you can see basically that since the war began,
Wow.
Europe has almost completely weaned itself off Russian gas and is replacing it with gas from Norway, and most importantly from LNG from the US and Qatar and Australia. Now, there are limits on LNG. It's complicated to export LNG. You have to produce more, you have to be able to ship it, you have to be able to regasify it. But the Europeans are building all sorts of floating regasification terminals that allow them to replace the Russian gas with LNG. And the Russians did not expect that this was going to happen. They really thought that the Europeans, as they did after 2014, would not be willing to pay themselves for the cost of supporting Ukraine. So that was a major miscalculation because those markets are not coming back. And yes, Russia can sell to India and China, but they're buying because they get enormous discounts, potentially up to 30% off of the global oil price. And so it's very advantageous for them, and they drive a very hard bargain.
Thanks so much. We have a lot of questions in the chat about the Ukrainian economy, and a couple also about efforts to fight corruption in Ukraine, and given your expertise on corruption as well as sanctions. So Marcia asks, how effective is the Ukrainian justice system in targeting and wiping out corruption? I know they caught and sacked upper level officials and appointees in their Defense Department. Do they have anything similar to what the US established in Afghanistan?
So corruption has always been a huge problem in Ukraine. It's one of the reasons that Ukraine's economy has never fully developed. The structure of the economy in Ukraine was one where you had oligarchs, kind of in the 90s sense of the word, who had taken over certain industrial sectors or certain parts of the country and had a lot of influence on the political process. And one of the reasons that Zelensky was not very popular before the war started, I think his approval rating was below 30%,
Right.
was because he hadn't really been able to deal with these clans and with these oligarchs. And corruption was still a significant problem. Now, it's hard to know what's happened since the war started. There's basically a tacit, or maybe not even tacit, agreement that you don't criticize the president during war. There does seem to still be a significant corruption problem in terms of, food aid and things like that either doesn't get delivered or gets misplaced along the way. And as the person who asked the question mentioned, like there were a couple officials sacked for either economic corruption or taking advantage of, for example, traveling abroad when men are not supposed to be traveling abroad. So a conflict of interest or abuse of position. And I think that this is one of the issues that is really going to have to be a priority for Ukraine after the war is over. Hopefully it's more or less being kept under control now, although again, I don't think we have any clear way of knowing. But given Ukraine's desperation to join Europe and to be part of Europe, they're going to have to do something very significant in terms of overhauling the judiciary and making it actually independent and actually being able to prosecute corruption. They had put some institutions in place with a lot of EU funding, but they weren't particularly effective. So that, I would say, is at the top of the to-do list for Ukraine. But at this point, I don't think they have the capacity to do that. I mean, they're basically paying their budget every year with American money that's being sent to the Ukrainian budget, because the economy there has shrunk 45% since the war started.
So can you talk a little bit more then about, so Vadim Staklo, one of my colleagues here at Mason, just put in the chat, how much longer can Ukraine operate under these kinds of conditions? It seems that Russia has I think been remarkable in its ability to adapt, but Ukraine is suffering and struggling, and surely that's going to have some impact going forward with the war. But also, and there was a question early on, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the person now, but also asking, sort of what is it that we can do? What is it the United States and Western Europe can do to try to help Ukraine to rebuild some of the GDP that it's lost over the last year?
All right, lots of different levels at which that question can be answered. I mean, I would say that kind of at the highest level, probably the best thing you can do is make sure that your congresspeople know that you want aid to Ukraine to keep flowing,
Mhm.
right? Because that's ultimately a political decision. And if Congress people, senators think that there's not popular support for Ukraine, eventually it will start to ebb. And that is, that's kind of the pattern that you see, that people get tired of a conflict or something else happens, or, there's the earthquake in Turkey where people are now concentrating resources. And so the only way to make sure that funding continues and support continues at the same level or intensified is by the American people making clear to government that they believe in supporting Ukraine. On an individual level, there are, of course, a number of charities that people can support. They do all sorts of different things, from buying military equipment for different Ukrainian divisions to providing humanitarian aid. And I think the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute has a list of resources for people who want to give donations. I can say also, kind of at a very low level, Etsy has a lot of Ukrainian artists and crafty people selling things. So do your birthday and Christmas shopping on Etsy from Ukrainian artists. And I did, and you have to give it a little time for the postal service, but it definitely gets all the way to the US. So I think that, as I said, like, visibility and support is extremely important. And then there's individuals doing what they can. So in academics, like Steve and Cynthia and I, like, we do a lot of public speaking to make sure that people keep this top of mind and understand why it's so important. But I think people can do that in their community circles also. I mean, you all are incredibly well informed after 15 sessions, or however many there are, 15 months of sessions, and just make sure that the people in your circles really appreciate what's going on and why it's important.
That's an amazing answer. And I mean, it would be a great closer, but there's a couple of great questions in the chat. Do you mind if we keep going for a couple
please.
more minutes?
Yeah.
Well, so there's sort of two questions I want to make sure we get to at the very least. Gail, first of all, was asking about ways of making the sanctions more effective, particularly recent U.S. efforts to really put pressure on Hungary and the other one, and Turkey. Yeah, Turkey. Can you speak to that?
So that's the question of secondary sanctions, right? So we impose sanctions, and we say,
Central Asia seems to be worried about secondary sanctions as
so
well.
like, let's say we say, Hewlett Packard can't sell computers to Russia, and Armenians buy computers and then from Hewlett Packard and then send them to Russia. And the question is, do you sanction Armenia for facilitating Russia's purchase of these American computers? And the US has been reluctant to do that. First of all, it gets extremely messy to prosecute that. And remember, like, one of the reasons that governments like sanctions is because you impose them and then everyone else has to enforce them. It's basically all corporate enforcement. And so it's a fairly cheap way to have a foreign policy. But the other thing is that, like, we want to work with Armenia. Armenia is our ally. So do we really want to be sanctioning them at all, given that they're also under pressure from Russia, and Russia is also trying to control them? So it becomes extremely complicated politically. And one of the things that I think is important is that, we have a tendency to be very, self-centric, right? We think that because the US and Europe and Japan and Australia support Ukraine, it's basically us on the side of good and Russia and China on the side of evil. And surely the rest of the world realizes that and supports us. And to some extent, I mean, the rest of the world, many countries have voted for UN resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But they're not exactly stampeding to punish Russia, to stop buying Russian grain and Russian fertilizer, Russian arms, Russian enriched uranium. Like, a lot of those countries need that stuff from Russia, and they're not going to be buying it from the US or Germany or the other places where they're more expensive. So they're naturally reluctant to get in the middle of this conflict and are just hoping that the thing would end and that we would stop this little European conflict that we're all so obsessed with and get back to focusing on the rest of the world. I don't know if that's an adequate answer. That's just one of my rants.
Fred, why don't we let you jump in?
Yes. By the way, the presentation was great. I really enjoyed it. I thought I'd pass that on. The question I'm going to ask, though, is I was talking to a friend of mine that I work with and who manages a number of farms in Iowa. And he's putting fertilizer down, and he's in the futures market, and he can't believe why right now corn prices are falling. But getting to where we're going to, we brought up the subject is how is Ukraine is the second largest corn producer in the world. And the question is, where are they going to get the fertilizers? And it goes to your subject of maintaining their economy into the future. How are they going to maintain that economy given the tremendous problems that they face?
Well, Ukraine is probably going to need something like a Marshall Plan to rebuild after the war. When it comes to fertilizer, there are two different kinds of fertilizer. There's, and I'm just at the edge of what I know at this point, right? But the nitrogen-based fertilizer is essentially made from natural gas. So the fact that Europe is no longer importing natural gas via pipeline from Russia makes it very expensive to produce nitrogen-based fertilizers in Europe, which was one of the major producers. So there are other kinds of fertilizer on the market, but there are not as many because now a lot of countries that used to make it out of natural gas are not going to be using more expensive LNG to make fertilizer. When it comes to Ukraine, you know, the harvest or the planting has definitely been interrupted by the war. Last year, they did pretty well. I mean, everybody saw those tractors, you know, pulling tanks out of the field so they could do the planting. But this year is looking pretty rough. Because of the war, because of the fact that, you know, a lot of the farmers are out fighting the war instead of doing the planting. Plus, there's the problem that since there were fewer exports, there's a lot of last year's harvest that's rotting in the silos that's not able to be shipped out. And so the question is, where are you going to put the new harvest when it comes in? It's going to be very difficult, right? It's going to be very difficult, particularly since agriculture was one of Ukraine's key exports, right? Sunflower oil, corn, as you said, wheat. It's the agricultural breadbasket of what used to be the former Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. It's this very vaunted black earth, which is so fertile. And one of the first areas of reconstruction is going to have to be putting agriculture back on its feet and making sure that there's a market in Europe for Ukrainian agricultural products, because Russia used to be Ukraine's biggest trading partner, right? They were sending a lot of the stuff there too. So we'll have to be able to support new markets for Ukrainian output.
Kathy Stein has a question in the chat that gets back to the restructuring of the Russian oligarchy. And she's actually wondering about this strange pattern of recent deaths of top-level directors and managers over the past year, and is asking whether this is something new, and does this have any particular significance for the Kremlin or any kind of relevance in terms of how the Kremlin is enforcing conformity amongst the elite?
I mean, there have been a lot of people falling out of windows. But there might have been a lot before and we just didn't notice, right? And it wasn't news. I think there's no way of knowing what's going on. I suspect that because there's a lot of economic restructuring happening, like all of those foreign countries companies left, and there were a lot of new things that could be taken over by Russian companies. There are probably a lot more infighting or fighting among different groups who want to take over, you know, car manufacturing or fast food restaurants or all of the different facilities that were basically abandoned by Western companies. So, you know, it sounds to me that the economy is reverting a little bit to the habits of the 1990s, which was more lawless, more people then it was assassinated as opposed to falling out the window. And I don't really know the extent to which the Kremlin is responsible. You know, is it that the Kremlin is knocking off the people that are problematic? It doesn't look like the people that are necessarily dying are the ones that are coming out against the war. So I suspect there are more commercial reasons for this sudden increase in mortality.
Can I just jump in and ask, I'm sorry, I know Josh, you're waiting, but Executive Fiat, on this kind of note, you said in your presentation how much you admire the director of Russia's central bank, like as just as a technocrat, right? As a banker, like faced with like serious challenges. And my fiance is also part Russian, and he's also a banker, and he thinks the same thing. Like he actually really has to professionally admire this woman. And I'm just wondering, do you have any idea of like what goes on in her head at night? Like, I mean, what's holding her loyal? I mean, is she into this like as a patriot? Does she just see this as like her duty? I know I'm asking you to speculate, but I wonder about her because
a lot of people are asking that question, right?
Because she has so much connection to like the Western, she speaks the language that we speak.
So, rumor has it that no, she's not into this, right? That she tried to resign and Putin wouldn't let her. And, like if you say you want to resign as the head of the central bank and Putin says no, you're kind of stuck. I have heard, however, so her husband used to be the head of the Higher School of Economics. And I have heard from people who rather shocked tell me that when they meet him in private, he is extremely pro-war. So I don't know what goes on in her head. It looks like in his head, there's no doubt that the war is a good idea. But I think she's kind of focused on the task at hand and is maybe compartmentalizing, the political implications. I do know that, a lot of people that work for unsavory regimes manage to convince themselves that they're keeping the regime from being worse, right? That if I weren't here kind of keeping the ruble under control and there were sudden devaluation, millions of people would be impoverished, right? So I think that you can always think of a rationalization for why you're doing the right thing, but it is a mystery to a lot of people.
Do you think she's a criminal?
Well, I guess, in her mind, like, is she a criminal?
No. I mean, like if there was going to be war crimes trials later or something like that.
I mean, is she complicit, right, is the question. Well, to some extent, she is allowing Putin to wage this war. I think when there are war crimes tribunals, like they don't usually go after the central bankers, that there are other people that are closer to the crimes, if you will. But I don't know. A lot of people do think that she is complicit. And as you know, like millions of people have left Russia because they just don't want to be in a country where they're waging war on their neighbor. So to some extent, anybody who stays, you're like, like, why are you staying? But at the same time, it's pretty difficult to pick up your life and like leave with 2 suitcases and tell yourself you'll never be home. So I don't want to be judgmental, but it's very hard not to be in this case. I guess I would leave it at that.
Let's turn to Josh. Josh is a Mason alum and he's living in Moscow right now. And I think, Josh, before you joined, Alexandra talked a lot about how things don't look all that different in Moscow. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you see living there.
Yeah, certainly. So I graduated back in 2019, studied Russian. That was my diploma. I have a minor in criminology. And I had the good fortune to teach at a very rich school downtown center Moscow, teaching oligarchs' children, basically. Now I teach adults. I teach very rich Russians. I teach very rich Latvians as well. For the Latvians, their gas prices have tripled, right? And I teach a lot of CEOs, and they keep complaining to me how they're going to have to shut down soon. My beer here still costs $1 for half a liter, right? Chips have gone up maybe by 50 cents.
Are we talking potato chips or semiconductor chips?
And it's crazy. I go to an expat Orthodox church in the center. Our priest, he's American, but he serves with the patriarch. The other priest was the personal translator for the patriarch. And so I rubbed shoulders with a lot of very rich, influential people. And one of the biggest things on my mind was, well, would you stay here? Because it's a lot of expats and expats married to Ukrainians who come over here. They bring their family. And everybody told me yes, right? Like, I own this apartment that I'm in now, and we're planning to buy another apartment here. My wife wanted to flee as soon as the war broke out last year. And we did after I got baptized Orthodox. I said, all right, we're not going anywhere. Let me get baptized. And we spent 3 months in Turkey. We spent 3 months in Georgia. Nothing changed, so we came back, right? I was interviewed by First Channel in Oriol, where my wife is from, because I've written 4 books, right? And Turgenev is from there. They wanted to know an American's perspective. And yeah, we're not seeing an effect from the sanctions. Like, everything's normal. I get paid from Latvia, right? The Latvians pay me, and they really don't like Russians, right? Even though a lot of their family members are connected as well. What do you think the U.S. could do? What more?
Thanks, Josh.
I don't think that there's anything more we can do to make Russians suffer per se. I'm not even sure that that's the right thing to do. I think the only way to really affect this war is to provide more aid to Ukraine, and to allow it to push Russia out of its territory. Right. I think that, not only are the economic sanctions not really affecting the average Russian, but second of all, the sanctions literature suggests that that's not how you get governments pressured into changing policies. And third of all, Russia doesn't seem like the kind of culture where people very often take to the street. Right. I mean, the revolution was not a great experience for a lot of people, and they're not eager to revisit that. So that means that if you can't weaken Russia, then you have to strengthen Ukraine. And I think that that's where our efforts should be focused. Which is not to say we should eliminate sanctions, right? We should continue tightening them and keeping them, but not expecting that that's actually going to hasten the end of the war.
Alexandra, we've already kept you past our appointed hour. We so appreciate this. Just seeing that we still have 110 out of the 115 people here tells you that everybody has been just wrapped in every word that you've been saying. And we, I know Cynthia and I, like, through this, we've often wanted somebody who could really come and talk to us about economic issues. And this has been so helpful for me, and I'm sure for people in the audience. So I'm just really grateful for you being here today.
Well, I'm honored to have had the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, and that said, then everybody, we will look forward to seeing you next week for our session with Rana Mitter, who's a specialist in modern China. And please keep in mind that the time will be changing. We are going to meet at noon. And actually, Steve, you were saying the clocks changed? I forgot all about that.
Yeah, our clocks are changing. We're going to daylight savings time this weekend, but not every country is. So the number of hours between us and you might be changing. So just make sure you double check. So we'll be meeting at noon Eastern Daylight Time, our time here in the Eastern United States. And we're really looking forward to it. I mean, you already see from what Alexandra was saying earlier, how important China is to everything that's going on, not to mention that we just want to ask Rana about things that are happening in China and the Chinese-US relationship right now, and all of these things that are
change over time from the era of Deng Xiaoping to today.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation.
Lots to talk about.
So have a great week.
Thank you, God. Alexandra set like an impossibly high bar, but it might be almost as good, So thank you so much.
Okay, have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next Friday.